Today, it is commonly taken for granted that fascism was as extreme right as communism is extreme left. But is this really the case? Indeed, this was not always the consensus. Historian Paul Gottfried writes that in the late 1930s, quote, the pro-free enterprise American right continued to see fascism, and to some extent Nazism, as a revolutionary leftist force. American New Dealers and their social democratic allies were praising the Italian fascist model while establishing an American welfare state, end quote. Nicolas Farrel writes, quote, yet immediately the Italian left, self-proclaimed Marxists and Communists, branded fascism a reactionary force in the service of the bourgeoisie. It would keep on saying so. History, by and large, has accepted this definition of fascism, but fascism was anything but a right-wing movement, end quote, though it could be described as a right wing of socialism. It was its own entity, a third way, distinct from and opposed to both capitalist bourgeois liberalism and communism. This video will examine the structure of the Italian fascist state, and in what ways the regime was culturally right while being economically left. Here I am blatantly using 3 handy charts I took directly from Tick's videos on fascism. Again, I highly encourage you to watch him because he is better versed in these matters than I am, and more experienced at making videos. In this first chart, we see what most people imagine. Socialism is left, while capitalism, classical liberalism, anarchism, as well as Nazism and fascism are all right. But what exactly could this mean? Tick points out that the political spectrum is really mostly a matter of group identity and collective centralized power on the left, and individual identity and decentralization of power on the right. Put another way, the right-winger believes we need individual liberties to protect against and prevent exploitative and abusive governments, while the left-winger believes we need a big government to protect against exploitative and abusive individuals. Thus, fascism and Nazism, at least in this regard, are left-wing, being movements based on the authority and unity of the nation. Now, monarchy might complicate this chart, but Tick doesn't really discuss that, and it goes beyond the scope of this video series, so I will leave that to Lavender's analysis. Anyway, with that said, I do affirm that some elements of fascism were and are right-wing. In blending right and left elements, I sometimes like to half-jokingly say that fascism is really radical centrism. Defending inheritance was one definite unsocialist action of Mussolini's. Quote, I had to respect honestly accumulated wealth and make everybody understand the value, not only economic but also moral, of inheritance transmittable in families. Because of this, though I had approved a tax reform of great importance, I restored many rights, such as the right of succession. It was made clear that I would never approve subjecting inheritance to a taxation which had almost assumed a socialistic character of expropriation. Interference with succession strikes a blow at the institution of the family. Fascist party membership cards were given gratuitously to disabled war veterans, families of fallen fascists, and fathers of families of 7 or more children, demonstrating fascism's appeal to both militarism and traditional family values. The oath of joining the fascist party reads, quote, in the name of God and of Italy, I swear to carry out without discussion the orders of the Duce, and to serve the cause of the fascist revolution with all my might, and if necessary, with my life. This encapsulates the unique blend of fascism, Christianity, nationalism, and a revolutionary, not conservative, spirit. In early 1926, the Italian parliament passed the Legge Sindacale, or syndicate law, founding the corporate state. Mussolini himself wrote that, quote, amid the innovations and experiments of the new fascist civilization, there is one which is of great interest to the whole world. It is the corporate organization of the state, which was one of the basic legislative and social creations of the regime. This produced unions of both capital and labor, employer and employee in each given field, with the intention of ending class conflict. Political historian Sheldon Richman wrote that, as an economic system, fascism is socialism with a capitalist veneer. The state coordinated production, but did not assume ownership of the means of production. Mussolini said that the, quote, corporative and fascist state concentrates, controls, and harmonizes and tempers the interests of all social classes, which are thereby protected in equal measure, whereas, during the years of the demo-liberal regime, labor looked with diffidence on the state, and was, in fact, outside the state and against the state. Today, there is not one working Italian who does not seek a place in his corporation. Fascism ended the class struggle with a national social revolution rather than an international socialist revolution, uniting nationalists and socialists, bourgeois capitalists and proletarians. While this relationship demonstrates sympathy for the working class, it did not tolerate dissent from the proletariat any more than it did from the business obers. Doctrines and institutions declared, quote, "The lockout and the strike are forbidden." American ambassador and fascist admirer Richard Child wrote in his foreword to Mussolini's 1928 autobiography, quote, "Mussolini has been up the socialist, the international communist, the liberal, and the conservative hills and down again. He says, the sanctity of an ism is not in the ism. It has not sanctity beyond its power to do, to work, to succeed in practice. It may have succeeded yesterday and fail tomorrow, failed yesterday and succeed tomorrow. The machine, first of all, must run." This flexibility of fascism makes pinning it down frustratingly difficult, and allowed Mussolini to try different things without being tied to ideological loyalty. We inherit from both the left and the right that which was vital in each. In 1927, George Bernard Shaw wrote, quote, "Some of the things Mussolini has done, and some that he is threatening to do, go further in the direction of socialism than the English Labour Party could yet venture if they were in power." Mussolini himself agreed. "There is little about which social welfare research has adjudged practical to national economy or wise for social happiness, which has not been already advanced by me." Against the claim that Mussolini was funded by right-wing bourgeoisie as a defense against socialism, Shaw wrote, quote, "Why does Mussolini get that support instead of Signores Salvemini, Giolitti, Turati, Matteotti, and their friends, in spite of the fact that he was farther to the left than any of them?" One aspect of Mussolini's regime, often overlooked, is his progressive social welfare programs. According to Doctrines and Institutions, employees were to pay up to 1 day's wages per annum in corporation dues, at least 1/10 of which were to be placed in a capital fund to guarantee the liabilities incurred by the associates with reference to the collective contracts which they had stipulated. Doctrines and Institutions also asserted that the workers' right to a weekly day of rest to fall on Sunday, that the right, in the event of cessation of labor relations, through discharge without fault on his part, to an indemnity proportional to his years of service. Similar indemnity is also due to his family or representatives in the event of death of a worker, and that illness on the part of the worker, provided it does not exceed a certain period, shall not put an end to the labor contract. Call to military service or to service in the national militia shall not be grounds of discharge. Once in power, Mussolini used surgical violence to suppress opposition, while also suppressing violence that he did not approve of and that he deemed equally detrimental to the image of his regime and the stability of Italy. Even historian Paxton admits that, quote, "While Mussolini spilled more blood in coming to power than Hitler did, his dictatorship was relatively mild after that." The Special Tribunal for the Defense of the State sentenced 4,596 political offenders and handed out 42 death sentences, of which only 31 were actually carried out, and only around 6,000 persons were placed under house arrest or internal exile. And Mussolini regularly granted amnesty to political prisoners on fascist anniversaries and Catholic holidays. This is a little compared to the millions killed and imprisoned under Hitler or Stalin, and even the thousands under Robespierre's French Revolutionary Reign of Terror. Mussolini was a dictator, but he was statistically one of the most peaceful dictators in history. Despite using surgical violence, Mussolini opposed rogue fascist street violence, now itself a threat to the stability of the regime which he wanted to normalize. In 1927, Mussolini disbanded the squadristi and founded the Fascist Secret Police, OVRA, demonstrating the shift from street gangs to totalitarian state. In his speech for the Feast of the Ascension, May 26, 1927, he said that while in the founding days of fascism, Squadrissimo had been grand and heroic, it had become absurd and idiotic. Throughout the 1920s, enforced retirements led to the departure of hundreds of incompetent or politically unreliable officials, but not a single officer was killed. While this may seem like a low bar, the record suggests that had the Reds gained power in Italy, the purge of the police would have been larger and involved a different kind of enforced retirement. The relationship between Benito Mussolini and King Vittorio Emanuele III was complicated and nuanced. Throughout Italian fascism's 2 decades of existence, there remained a kind of diarchy of king and dictator, in which the latter undoubtedly exercised more power, but in the end, the former removed the latter from power. To symbolize their alliance, the royal coat of arms was amended with the addition of the fasces. The king reigned, the duce governed. This relationship of a chancellor being more powerful than the monarch was not unique to fascism, as Otto von Bismarck outshined his Kaisers, Cardinal Richelieu his Louis XIII, and Clemens von Metternich his Habsburg emperors. Following October 1924, the Volunteer Militia for National Security would swear allegiance directly to the king, not to Italy, the Fascist Party, or Mussolini. Mussolini's fascism, doctrines, and institutions pays homage to the monarchy by referring to Italy as a kingdom and referencing numerous times royal decrees. Explicitly, it states that, quote, "The executive power is exercised by His Majesty the King through his government. The Prime Minister is the head of the government. The head of the government is appointed and revoked by the King, and is responsible to the King for the general policy of the government." As part of his vision to invigorate Italy at home and its reputation abroad, Mussolini fought a series of battles. Mussolini's battle for the lira was a great success, especially considering the depth to which the economy had plunged during the 4 chaotic years following World War I. Mussolini wrote, quote, "By the end of 1920, the lira was worth just 1/4 of its value in 1914. By 1921, the cost of living was 400% higher than in 1915. The Banca Italiana di Scotto had crashed at the end of 1921. In response, the government simply printed more money, making the problem worse through inflation. By January, the lira had lost half its value. 10,000 lira was worth only 5,200 francs. In spring 1922, Italy was in debt 6 billion lira. At the end of 1924, Mussolini's government had a surplus of 170 million. As soon as November 1922, the lira had risen 8 points to the pound and almost 5 points to the dollar. In December 1927, the lira was brought back to the gold standard, and in 1928, Mussolini was able to boast, quote, "Today we have a balanced budget," for the first and only time in Italian history. Mussolini's battle for grain was an attempt to make Italy self-sufficient. While Italy did become self-sustaining in grain by 1933, other more profitable crops declined in proportion, such that for a time Italy was importing olives. This was perhaps one example of Mussolini making things worse by taking on too much direct authority and not trusting subsidiarity and the free market's regulation of supply and demand. Mussolini's battle for births was meant to increase the population of Italy. Toward this end, he implemented a bachelor tax in 1927 on unmarried men aged 25 through 65, increased laws against contraception and abortion, and awarded cash prizes to women with a certain number of children, all of which supported his relationship with the Vatican. In 1928, Mussolini launched massive public works projects. These included successfully draining the malaria-infested Pontine marshes to the south of Rome, which previous emperors, popes, kings, and prime ministers had failed to do, thereby creating hundreds of acres of workable land. He bulldozed old buildings to make the Via dei Fori Imperiale, connecting the Piazza Venezia and Altare della Patria with the Colosseum. Under Mussolini's direction, Augustus Caesar's mausoleum was excavated, and the Ara Pacis was excavated and reassembled on the banks of the Tiber, where it stands today. Historian Robert Paxton nonchalantly glances over the several attempts, at least 3, on Mussolini's life in the early 1920s, as if tacitly approving of them. Similarly, Paxton predictably leaves out the fact that the Italian partisans that killed Mussolini in 1945 were communists. Most people today who know about Mussolini at all, that is, believe that Mussolini was, quote, killed by other Italians, drawing that he was therefore unpopular and despised by his own people. But this is just as misleading as if someone just knew that Abraham Lincoln and John F. Kennedy were assassinated by other Americans. Similarly, in his work, Ordinary Violence in Mussolini's Italy, historian Michael Ebner rebukes Mussolini for arresting communists for attempting to, quote, overthrow the state and incite class hatred, as if these were empty or baseless accusations, yet that is precisely what communists openly professed to seek to do. Paxton writes, quote, Fascists wanted to revolutionize their national institutions in the sense that they wanted to pervade them with energy, unity, and willpower, but they never dreamed of abolishing property or social hierarchy. Indeed, Mussolini actively defended private property and social hierarchy. The implication that fascism might have abolished private property and social hierarchy is one of Paxton's slips where he almost admits that fascism was leftist. Another instance is when he writes, quote, Indeed, fascist regimes tried to redraw so radically the boundaries between private and public that the private sphere almost disappeared, in which he apparently does not notice that he is describing socialism. Another misevaluation Robert Paxton makes is his assessment of Mussolini's African ambitions. He claims that the pressure of youth and fanatics, quote, was one reason why in 1935 Mussolini took the classic way forward for a fascist regime, a war of aggression in Ethiopia. But there was nothing specifically fascist in the war in Ethiopia. That was a war of colonization, and Mussolini was only following France's and Britain's examples of what a great European power did. Paxton continues, quote, Fascist regimes could not survive without the acquisition of new territory for their race, Lebensraum, Spazio Vitale, and they deliberately chose aggressive war to achieve it, clearly intending to wind the spring of their own people to still higher tension. But this assessment is a gross oversimplification. Hitler viewed politics through the racial theory of history, in which blood and genetics were important above all, and needed a war because his economy was unstable and unsustainable. Mussolini's only war that he waged on his own was against Ethiopia, and that was simply a war of a European power claiming an African colony for itself. Even some in France, as well as the Holy See, at first supported it because they believed he would civilize it, for example, ending slavery. The Cardinal Archbishop of Milan praised the invasion, which, quote, brings in triumph the cross of Christ, breaks the chains of slaves, smooths out the road for the missionaries of the gospel. And Pius XII called the colonial war a crusade. Mussolini only annexed Albania in 1939, 17 years after coming to power, after Hitler annexed Austria and the Sudetenland, which Mussolini's efforts had delayed since 1933. But that's a topic for another video, perhaps. The idea that Mussolini's regime needed war to prop itself up only makes sense through the lenses of World War II, and is clearly untrue when looking at the economy and morale of fascist Italy itself. And yes, I do admit and do not deny war crimes committed by fascist Italy against African natives. But this was par for the course for European empires, not something uniquely characteristic of fascism. Speaking of Africa and weird fascist things, in 1927, Mussolini was given the Sword of Islam by the Berber leaders of Tripoli, Libya, and the title Protector of Islam. Indeed, he would fund mosques and madrasas and promised peace, justice, well-being, and respect for the laws of the Prophet. Reminds me again of someone else in history who tried and managed to woo the Catholics, the Jews, and the Muslims. Going back to disagreeing with historians, Walter LaCour, in his work Fascism, Past, Present, and Future, diagnoses that, quote, fascism was evil and bound to lead to catastrophe. This may be true regarding Nazism and the Holocaust, but falls flat when attempted to be applied to every, or even most, other fascist movements and regimes, including Italy. Lacour makes a mistake in assessment about German and Italian fascism, perhaps because he equivocates socialism in general with international socialism, Marxism or communism, in particular. He is correct that Hitler and Mussolini both dissolved worker unions and froze wages, but this is precisely part of their controlled, that is, socialist economy. Worker unions, after all, were dissolved, and wages were controlled in the Soviet Union, too. Lacour is correct when he identifies that the supreme aim of fascism was to reintegrate the working class into the main body of the nation, thereby ending class warfare. But he ignores evidence, including some of which he himself presents, when he claims that, quote, the fascists had no wish to engage in radical social reforms, let alone a social revolution. He later directly states that, quote, fascism thought of itself as a movement of cultural revolution, a contention that was not altogether wrong. It is no wonder that normal people don't know what to think about fascism, because even the historians and academics don't know what they think about fascism. A few bonus highlights to close out this episode. Although Nayib Bukele of San Salvador currently holds the title of coolest dictator, I believe that title belonged to Mussolini back in his day. He had a pet tiger, was given a ticket for speeding in his Alfa Romeo, and was famous for having breakfast solely of milk. That's right, the meme of right-wing white boys drinking milk started with Benny Mussolini.